Welcome back to Notice That, an EMDR podcast. We are virtually on Zoom doing an interview with Marshall Lyles, which we are so excited to be doing today, and to get to just explore more specifically the approach with EMDR therapy, looking at it with sand tray, attachment focus and all of that, and much, much more. So Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. I want to give an introduction of who you are and what you do that's really robust and covers everything, but I feel like you could probably do that much better than I could. So will you share with us and our listeners more about like what you do, what you specialize in, and kind of your history with EMDR?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm a marriage and family therapist by training, and a registered play therapist. Mostly I work in the world of expressive therapies. And so I do a lot of work in sand tray and poetry. Those are my two primary integrations in the world of EMDR. There's, art and clay in particular and other things, but especially during the pandemic, poetry and sand have been the easiest to continue on virtually.
Less hands-on.
Yeah, it's hard to do clay over the computer. I have tried, but it's been challenging. And I do supervision, I do consultation, I write. I get to teach for a couple of adjunct opportunities with a few different places. Usually it's related to sand tray, but I'm on faculty in an interpersonal neurobiology program too. So I do a little sciencey work here and there. It's just kind of a varied experience, but mostly I work out of this home base. I have a lovely workshop in Austin that's an art space where my pottery studio is. It's where I work with clients. It's where I teach from.
I'm curious, were you an artist first or a therapist first, or how did you come to this kind of wedding together of the two?
Right. Yeah. Good question. Because I'm still unraveling that myself. How is this what I do for a living? Where did this come from? I grew up in a very rural part of Texas. And so, when the school counselor would come around and tell you your 4 choices for a career, therapist was not,
not one of them.
of things that I wanted to be a writer. So I studied communications and English, going towards journalism was my interest. And in fact, I was getting to do some newspaper work and my later part of undergrad. And then out of nowhere, it was an advisor, my communications advisor, sat me down and said, your writing is really all about therapy. Are you sure? Are you sure you're not a therapist? And so she arranged a meeting for me to go spend some time with a friend of hers who ran an MFT program. And so it really kind of just found me. And so I was primarily thinking of myself as a writer, and then moved towards a marriage and family therapist unknowingly. I had no idea what it meant. I had no understanding what I was choosing. Sometimes I think in hindsight, if someone had given me a brochure that actually described, what we do, I think I would have been too scared to do it. And yet, ignorance allowed me to step right on in.
And I don't know your experience. I had lived some time in Texas as well, but also grew up in a rural area in Nebraska. And therapy isn't something that's there's not a lot of positive regard to the process of therapy or being a therapist. In fact, I almost feel like it's the butt end of a lot of jokes. And so was that your experience in navigating, like entering into that career path in that area?
It was a lot of conversation ending declarations, where I could just feel the people were like, oh, I don't know what else to say after you tell me that's what you do or what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And so I didn't experience necessarily a lack of support, but there was just no template, for people to understand where I was coming from and what I did. And so I did feel a little, even like now in hindsight, I can realize I was feeling a little rebellious by choosing it, like, oh, look, this is the opposite of all the things that I would have grown up around. And so I think it was appealing to me because it felt somehow
So different.
exotic. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also my dad was a minister. And so there was an air of some of this job, around. I don't work in any way similar, to what I would have seen in that world growing up. But it took me a while to realize there are parts of my job that he does understand. We just anchor into it very, very differently. But where I'm from, the only people who did this kind of work were clergy.
Yeah, pastors, ministers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in your journey of, going to school to become a therapist, where did EMDR come into the picture specifically?
I was a reluctant convert of it.
Yay, that's exciting.
I remember being curious about it. My first exposure to it was a little problematic. And so, how sometimes you then associate an entire approach with one person. And so my first encounter was not one that left me with a bunch of curiosity, but then it was over time disconfirmed by another person who I watched, I worked with, and I watched her work, and I watched how her clients were changing in the lobby. As you go to the lobby and when you work in a group practice and you all descend onto this one spot once an hour. And so you don't ever know any of these people, but you watch them somatically over the course of months. And there was something happening in her population who she was treating. So I asked her one day, like, what approach she was pursuing. And she said EMDR. And I thought, well, crap, I don't want to do that. I don't want to know more about that. I already decided I don't like that. But I did eventually, I can't remember exactly when, maybe 12, 15 years ago, I went for basic training, an amazing trainer. I've gotten to work with him a lot since going through the training. But weekend one was really hard for me. I'm an expressive therapist. And so someone gave me worksheets and told me to read from a worksheet. And I felt bumbly and like disfluent. And how do you maintain relational connection while doing all of this? And so I wasn't convinced that it was going to ever find home in my spirit. But just had these amazing consultants who, brought life to it and helped me find my version of how to be really practicing with fidelity, but still understanding that there was a place for creativity.
Oh my gosh. If we could capture just that one statement and out of this whole podcast episode, I feel like it's so important. And I want to explore more about how you did that, because I feel like someone who's really focused in expressive arts and just a man of the arts in general, to be given a script and a standardized protocol that says, this is how you do it. And I don't know what your experience was in learning it, but I think one of the errors of the field of EMDR is that it's taught in a way oftentimes where people are receiving it in a way that there's like a right and a wrong. And so if you don't follow that script, somehow I'm breaking the rules and doing it wrong and can't do it that way. And so a lot of like the consultation we do and the podcast is all about not seeing it in these like black and white concepts and right and wrong, but more so branching out and saying, how can we begin to integrate other ways of presenting and doing it while still maintaining fidelity and, meeting those objectives?
I think it's so critical. I mean, it's really become my passion, because it's hard for me to sometimes, as involved as I am in the EMDR world, it's hard for me to reconcile that I'm belonging to an approach that uses protocols.
Yeah.
That alone is just hard for me to make sense of. But I think part of the problem is there's an assumption that the language on the worksheets is the same thing as fidelity to the model. And we know that that's not true, because trainers use different worksheets.
Right.
And yet it's being taught a lot of times, or at least being understood, even if it's not being taught that way, as the worksheet is the fidelity. When people are saying, trust the script, well, make sure you're saying, trust the script for now. Trust the script until you've internalized the mechanics and you understand why these things flow in this order, so that later when you have a client that doesn't meet conventional presentation, you understand why you would flip around at different things. And there's something being lost in translation about a lot of those dynamics.
Marshall, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what neurobiology, what interpersonal neurobiology is really doing in the world of EMDR, because I feel, that's where I draw so much of my experience from, and where I really ground myself in the fidelity principle of EMDR, because if I know that it tracks neurobiologically, then I know that also it's going to, be within that fidelity of EMDR. And so I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the more we learn about the brain, the more it's saying, understand memories, understand relationship.
Yes.
Like those are the things, like
That's
boil
beautiful.
everything else down. That's really what we're coming to know. And that's what EMDR is, I think, really does put forward in a really strong way. The other thing about neurobiology is we don't really know anything.
Right.
Like we hear a theory, we hear an approach, and as therapists, we get so excited that science might be giving a blessing on what we do, that we then cling to it, and we are rigidly speaking it as truth instead of holding it as a theory that's going to change. Yeah. In 10 years, most of what we think is gonna change. And if we're so cult-like in our rigid holding to something, we're not leaving room for updates, then we're setting ourselves up to contradict everything interpersonal neurobiology is telling us.
Yeah, that's rigidity and chaos right there.
It is. Yeah, it really is. Even like, for example, this might get me in trouble right off the bat. I'm a very gentle mischief maker. Just so because
I think I can pick up on that a little bit. Yeah.
We use words in EMDR sometimes, and language is hard because it's limiting, but we use words and then we treat them as literal. And one of the phrases that always makes me shudder is touchstone memory. We don't know what the touchstone memory, I mean, who
That's
knows?
Preposterous.
What else? What we're trying to say is float back to something that helped form your meaning-making template for how you see now. But we in no way know if that was the moment or a moment. That's not how humans develop.
Yes.
The way that you made meaning started 14 generations ago. It didn't punctuate when you were 4. And so I think eventually we're gonna have to get a little more relaxed with our language while still practicing fidelity. So we're not imposing judgments on ourselves and our colleagues, on our clients, in the name of trying to practice something from an empirical point of view.
Yeah, my greatest desire is that whatever like fidelity means to EMDR also continues to grow and adapt and transform and change as the research and the science, kind of direct it to. And so just as you're talking about, when we get too rigid to something, and I think EMDR has had such a huge mark on the culture of therapy at this part, like it's been really transformational, that we don't get lost in trying to stay too rigidly cult-like or committed to this is what it has to be, that we don't stay curious about all of the other things that we're learning, and also say, like, how do we have EMDR keep up with that too, and be able to expand and grow with that. And so just hearing you talk about it in this way is really exciting to connect with other people and like that are seeing it in that same way.
Yeah, I feel like much of the way that we talk about it in the trainings that we do and in the different case conceptualization models that we have, it does, I like the phrase, like playfully, kind of challenge some of these presuppositions within old line EMDR that is so rigid to that script. We're asking us not to get caught up just in the three-pronged approach or the particulars of a script, but actually understand what is memory reconsolidation, what are these disconfirming experiences, and this mismatch that we're really trying to help their system feel like they can accept the invitation to grab onto. And that's, yeah.
It's so complicated, isn't it? I mean, even those concepts you just brought forward, thinking how little we know about memory consolidation, and then it always inspires me. This is one of the things I love about EMDR, is it always reminds me how brave people are, that they come to us, strangers come to us as virtual strangers, saying the most wounding things I've ever been through, I'm willing to bring here. And then we, with memories, like we have in the early stages, this kind of history gathering, resourcing way of packaging things together. And then we move into the later phases and we break memories apart so that there's room for new meaning. And then in the later phases, you watch them come back together with this updated, and it's this beautiful dance. And there's so much courage and rhythm and beauty to it that I do feel rather inspired and lucky to do the work. I hope there's room for us to continue updating all the things that you all just said.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we get into the specifics of what you do with the expressive arts and the sand tray. I feel like there's, as a consultant, I get so many questions on like working with kids, working with families. How do we even start to bring the super standardized approach in with children? Because guess what? They don't buy it. Like they're not up for walking through the 8 phases with our script. So, and then you add parents into that and family dynamics. So I would love to just hear what that looks like in your practice and how have you begin to, integrate EMDR into that work?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you have much agenda with a kid, they're going to be, flipping your table over and licking the doorknobs. They're not gonna just go there because you said this is how people heal. But I always go back to the basics of AIP, and we say we believe in the power and the wisdom of the human sitting across from us, and that's not age limited, right? Like children come in with their own wisdom, with their own seeing. And in fact, they have a lot more access to natural strength than others. One of my mentors taught me that we're really broken in the way we teach therapy, because we start off new therapists saying your primary goal is to get your client to trust you. And she says that's backwards. Our primary goal is communicating to the client that we trust them, that their bodies, that their reactions are trustworthy, that they make sense. And so that, I think it's the same with kids. They need to understand and believe that I see all the logic and the protectors that have been developed to get through life. And so I just make open space. A lot of the early appointments after, meeting with parents and getting buy-in and making sure they understand where we're headed. When a kid walks in for the first time, it's, here's a tray of sand, here are figures. I do this with adults too, to be fair. I will say that even my adult clients, everybody gets the same treatment. Everybody's going to get messy if they come. And I just say, build your world. And that's where we start. And most of the time, without much prompting in the early sessions, they give me history. I don't have to accomplish phase one. Like they do it. And then there's a moment where they will shift to phase two. And if I just say build a world, they start building safe places. They start including wise figures. And then they naturally will move to recreating painful experiences. You don't always have to prompt it, like if we trust them, we trust them.
Well, and
and
that's so fundamental to the AIP model, which is really, we're just setting up a space for the body to do what it's naturally built to do. Yeah. And if it feels safe enough to do that, then those processes and action systems will, carry out their intentions. So I love that so much.
I totally agree. And I do accept, I think that there's a big responsibility you have if you're choosing to practice in an expressive way, then you can't rely on a worksheet. So you do have to know every aspect of that model, so that if you're going to say you're practicing EMDR, that you are indeed following, the same general concepts that other people do. So I think it's my job to make sure that I can recognize, okay, they just created a target. So I now need to hear, have they already given me a cognition? Is there a natural scaling opportunity available in this world? How many emotions and sensations have already been described? So am I just reflecting, or do I need to interview? And if I'm interviewing, am I asking the client directly, or am I asking through one of the figures? And they reveal all of those things to you. It's just patiently being present.
So, and what I hear you saying, and I just think this is beautiful, is that instead of us as the therapist cueing these responses for the sake of, meeting our task that we think we need to have met, we're instead being very observant and attuned to what's naturally unfolding in the space and identifying what's happening in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes the more attachment wounded a client is, they might communicate to you directly or through their behavior that they need you to have momentarily more of a leadership role. So I'm not anti being a little more directive, when that's what the client is communicating they need. And so there's no reason you can't turn each of the EMDR phases into prompts, create a genogram and gathering family history, or, those are often really needed. But I think the client will tell you what they need, and then there's space for just waiting.
Yeah. So where do you start to, and how do you start to integrate the bilateral stimulation in with this?
I introduce BLS in the first session or two, just preemptively, like in case we need it. And so if it's a kid, I have a lot of random things happening around where you all can't see right now, but there's a percussion section over here, and there's some kind of like a whole collection of different ones and things. And so sometimes it's scavenger hunt like, and I'll explain the concept of how our body has this rhythm that it desires. It just wants to go back and forth. And sometimes it's slow. Whenever we're trying to hold something new, sometimes when we're trying to figure something out, it's fast. Can you go find all the different ways your eyes and ears and body can do that? And we might just turn that into a scavenger hunt, and they will often show me tactily or with eye movements what they're comfortable with. Like right now, I have one with me here. This always great to do something visual on a podcast. Very engaging, but I'll describe it.
Well, we have the whole thing recorded, even video, so we can release what we need.
Yes. But my EMDR trainer uses this thing from an auto part store that's mechanics, like telescoping magnet, and for eye movements or for tapping. And since it's magnetized, some of my kids prefer use putting magnets on it, right? And so I let them choose. And so one of my clients right now loves Harry Potter. So we use this Gryffindor magnet, just put it on the end, and that becomes the eye movements. And so they sometimes can help me find. Other times, if it's more traditional play or traditional art, I try to introduce bilateral within whatever medium they're drawn to. So if they love clay, then I might keep 2 lumps of clay out for squeezing, or in the sand tray, I have one like narrow, skinny tray that sits right below my regular tray that we can do figure eights in, or put the light bar behind. And so I try to give them some choice, and I try to keep it as related to the medium as possible, so we're not leaving it to do that part. But I just show them early, and then let them find their own comfort.
That's beautiful. I'm wondering, as you encounter varying degrees, with the adoption type of work, that's really where I think so much of the conversation we've had up to this point really shows its importance. Not to say that it doesn't with other clients, but with those that have experienced abandonment or, that relational rupture in their family system, this type of invitation to be playful and expressive and creative can be something that kind of either brings up a like, yes, I'll just do this, or maybe a no, or, how you navigate some of that specifically with this population in that adoption work.
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. If I had my way, every phase 1 teaching in the EMDR would include an attachment assessment.
Yes, absolutely.
Because what pocket and stream of attachment someone's primarily living in response to their wounds really sets you up to know what kind of resources they need, what are going to be the likely blocking beliefs, and what kind of interweaves would make the most sense. You really can hold a lot more attuned awareness if you're aware of that patterning. The EMDR is no different than most of therapy. There's an attachment security bias in the field, and so models are developed assuming security is going to walk in the door. And so one of the ways that happens in EMDR, and I see it with my adopted clients a lot, is there's an assumption that prior to the trauma existed safety. And so when we talk about phase 2, it's really, we're talking about returning to the pre-existing level of security that happened, that was there before the trauma. And for, not all, but a lot of people who have lived through adoption, that they didn't have access to all of that. So sometimes you're patterning in, again, depending on their story and depending on how long they've been in their placed home, you might be patterning in security for the first time. Yes. So thinking all of this traditionally just is not all that helpful. So you really do have to have some ways of coming to know that part of them early.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a given with the adoption population, but it's so often what I see with my clients with really complex cases, or just, so frequently that there is not security walking in the door. And so even as we go into like the most basic resource of calm, safe place, like that exercise can be so activating, because safety is not a recognizable experience for them.
Yeah, and safety feels threatening.
Yes.
Like, oh, I'm only alive because I didn't let myself feel falsely safe.
Yes.
I stayed vigilant or dissociative, and that's how I got through. And now here you are, you big fool, telling me to do the thing. And, it can be really activating. Yes. And that's even true for, some of our clients who have attachment security, but their traumas are relational in nature.
Yes.
That they can still have that same. So one of the things I tell my consultees is let's try not to use the word safe. There are other ways to say it, but regardless of what language you use, safe place is as much an assessment as it is a resource.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so just treat it as information. Whatever they do is information they needed you to understand to plan for where to go next. That's all that's happening.
So much of our model and how we work is focusing on relationship. And so I just am really curious in the way you're practicing as you have these really beautiful ways for them to express themselves. How much does the relationship between you and the client come to play in all of this?
Yeah, I don't know how you do therapy without it.
Mhm.
You know, it's a mystery to me. I remember early in my career writing a conference proposal for a conference in the expressive world. And when it got rejected, the feedback was there was an overemphasis on relationship in the proposal. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, people think that in our field.
Wow.
You know, this is
Overemphasis.
yeah. And that has stuck with me. Like I used it as the motivation to be like, I will not change that part of me. You know, that I don't know what else there is to do. So I think from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view, you know, that's how we anchor in is, you know, be it, you know, Siegel and his contributions, Pat Ogden and hers, Bruce Ecker and memory science, Porges and Deb Dana, and all of them are saying it's safety.
Yes.
You know, everybody's
Safety and
saying
connection.
it's safety.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Safety and connection. Absolutely.
I think that we just don't always know what that means in our field, you know, and therapists are wounded people and as well. And so I wish that I could somehow just like, you know, drop some sort of like virtual hug into every therapist office and say, you have to start here. Like, do you feel loved? Do you feel important? Do you feel worthy? Do you feel that what you do matters? If not, do not leave your office. Do not walk to your lobby. Do not welcome anyone into your space.
That's right.
Until you are securely there, because you can't be relational otherwise.
Yeah. One of the podcasts that was so helpful to me throughout college and throughout my graduate school experience was Therapist Uncensored. They're based in Austin. And one of the things that they said on that podcast that I just was struck by, and this is before I'd been EMDR trained or done any of this work, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to have the relationship? Because then we could just heal on our own and there'd be no problem at all. We could just go walking down the street, just these, you know, self-regulating beings, but that's not what a human is. That's not what a human, you know, mammalian organism actually is. We are dependent largely on our relationship. And that's honestly where a lot of our trauma comes from. So then healing must have that component as well.
I have real fantasies about just becoming robot.
Yeah.
It would just be so handy. It would solve
just
so
to be
many
Terminator
things.
Or, you know, to be able to have those abilities.
You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about, I have muscular dystrophy. I was born with it. And so some of my earliest memories are a part of my diagnosis journey, you know, the tests. And I can still picture the faces of doctors and nurses. You know, this was 40 years ago for me. And I can still, and when I recall them, I can tell you which ones I decided were safe and which ones weren't.
Wow.
You know, that all of that was nonverbal. And that would, again, that's what we're learning from attachment science and neurobiology is that what we say has very little bearing on whether or not someone experiences us as secure and as having the capacity to be a part of their healing. It's happening in what you transmit. You know, it's coming through your body, through your voice, through your tone. All of those things betray you. You know, so we've got to start with congruence.
Yes.
So how do you like practically bring that into like this merging of EMDR and Sandtray or working with clay poetry? How do you really emphasize the relationship and offering that safety or that felt sense of safety with your clients?
Yeah. And, you know, we have these little moments in EMDR kind of fidelity that are handy. For example, we all talk about the stop signal. That is a beautiful moment early in, like, don't just say, you can say stop whenever you want, like make that an empowering thing and then practice it. I want you to right now tell me to stop and watch whether or not I can handle it. Let's not wait until we need it in a moment of terror. Let's let the relationship start experiencing all of these concepts and prove to their nervous system that we can be the things that we're offering to them. So I think making sure that we're anchoring every little moment into that kind of foreshadowing that, oh, wait, am I just telling them about this? Or is this something that we're experiencing right now in our relationship?
Yeah. And to take something like the stop signal that can be just a cognitive concept. I'm going to tell you this concept and we can use it, and to immediately, like, just the way you reframed that into like, let's actually just experience it together. Because what I'm saying to you doesn't really matter a lot to your body. It's how I'm going to respond to your signals of I don't feel safe or something, and this isn't okay.
I think some of the most healing moments I've experienced in EMDR is when someone told me to stop and I did. I think that there are many times that was a disconfirming experience as powerful as anything in the reprocessing.
Yes.
So we have opportunities.
Yeah. Think about how, just symbolic or perhaps directly linked to their trauma that actually might be. And then in having another person respond, not just with acceptance of the boundary, but also with continued invitation to connect even after.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That reminds me back to the world of adoption. With one of the major issues is disenfranchised grief. There's not a lot of experienced permission for bio parents, for adoptive parents, for adopted children to have their own truth experienced, their own ability to say, it's not what you've decided is true about my family. I need you to understand what it was like to be me. And because there's not a lot of room and space for that to happen, those parts get disenfranchised. We have to actively disprove that we're not a part of that world. They're waiting to see, can you recognize, not enforce an agenda, not expect me, not even to necessarily believe that because I'm adopted, I'm experiencing the kind of grief that you're talking about. But do you leave space for it? My kids are adopted, and I can't tell you how many times in our lives someone has said, y'all are just so great. What you did, I would never be able to do that, and I'm like, yeah, we're coming unglued at home. I'm going to go ahead and need you to not pedestal anything about this, and stop othering us in some like fantasy way.
Yeah. And we have an adopted daughter as well, and I relate to that so much. And they'll say it like right in front of her, and it's just like, oh, like it's othering us, it's othering her. And I know they mean so well in it, but it's a difficult thing to navigate. A response to that.
I will tell you, get better as you get older. You care less about being nuanced. that fades over time, but it's disrespectful to the bio family, that those bio parents are still in your kid, and the whole setup and this even bleeds into another area of passion for me. Based on my lived experience, is how much ableism is in our field and in the world. And the two things in the adopted world and in the world of disability, they're not all that different. I'm going to say a phrase that got me in trouble once before, but I'm going to do it again anyway.
This is a great spot to do that.
Oh, good. Have you all heard the phrase inspiration porn?
Oh,
No.
that there's like this like felt sense. Let me watch all the emotional videos. Let me get all the emotional content about other people's stories and ignore the struggle and just borrow from the strength that
the
I've
hope and
decided
the
is there.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of a false sense. And I think that that's part of that ableist and grief disenfranchisement that is just, I want to borrow from the part of your story that feels good to me to internalize. And I'm going to go ahead and leave the rest of it over there so you're on your own.
Yeah.
And it is really, as often as the hard things that kids live through in adoption, it's the reactions that really then create the toxic isolation and aloneness that makes the trauma more complex to heal. You know, it's the world as much as anything that they lived through originally.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to have an entirely other conversation with you just about like the disability piece of that, ability and disability. And
Yeah, I'm wondering like what your even thoughts are just from the, just the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Yeah. I think that like hearing you say that just sparks so much interest. I work with deaf and hard of hearing in the population that I work with because I can sign, and seeing so much of that, just one, like the cultural aspects of how therapy is set up is not at all congruent or supportive with the culture of the deaf and hard of hearing. And oh gosh, there's just so many layers to it. And I know that translates into just a variety of different disabilities. And there's nuances for each, but how therapy is set up for that.
Humility covers so much ground, doesn't it, as an EMDR therapist? Because your office is almost always going to have something in it that doesn't feel safe, and so you have a deaf, hard of hearing client or somebody like me who's more mobility impaired, or someone who has somewhere in the range of neurodiversity that's different than you comes in, and they're going to find something overwhelming or hard about your space. That's not automatically a problem. The problem is when you don't recognize it and have the humility to address it.
Yes.
That's when we really get into, we're now reinforcing. How can they ever get into phase 2 work with us if that's not a shared common experience?
Yeah, if we're not willing to like be able to step into and notice that discomfort and accept the expression of that discomfort or lack of safety, I think so often we can get in this gridlock of taking it personal in those ways rather than being able to stay humble and invite the expression
stay
of all
connected.
Of that.
Yeah, we get into that activated place. We were just having a conversation before this, Marshall, about kind of the nature of therapy and how, you mentioned it earlier about how brave people are to come in as a mammalian organism and start talking to a stranger about some of the things that have really made them feel the most vulnerable and insecure in their life, which from a evolutionary perspective is not something you want to disclose to other people or to other potential sources of threat. And so for us to even think that, our space that we've created to be as safe as possible, to rigidly hold on to that and not be open to another person's desire to change it in a way that would make them feel more safe or have their own touch on it to say, this is now a place for me as well. I just think
we can really quickly make it about our need to be appreciated instead of their need to be safe. And we don't know we're conflating the two always.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the environment, also our approach, right?
Absolutely.
This is what I do and this is how I practice and this always works. Like any of those really rigid or absolute constructs in what we're doing, if we can't stay open and really flexible with those and say there's aspects, and I'm thinking of EMDR specifically, but really any therapeutic approach, aspects of this that I may have to let go of or new things I have to integrate to really be able to like meet the person I'm trying to work with rather than trying to fold them into the practice that I want to do.
Oh yeah. for me, I think you just described why poetry makes a lot of sense for me. It's because of that level of we're establishing a baseline rhythm where we can come to hear each other without, like in a literal sense, without rules, without form, without punctuation. Like, can we just get a shared language that gets us rhythmically in the same place? And that you watch some of those things start to come into synchrony, because not all language is left-brained. There is some space for language to be over in the part of the brain where we as EMDR therapists are trying to get to enliven.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you bring poetry into your sessions or into your work?
Yeah, well, this is where, it's for sure about to get quirky.
We're both very quirky people, so we're very ready for this.
Well, for one, a lot of people had a bad experience with a high school English teacher, and so you can't always use the word poetry. I've learned, especially teenagers. Some
what
are
are
very
your code words for it? Like, what are
sometimes I just call it lyrics, because almost everybody loves songs.
Yeah, there you go.
Like if we were to rewrite that song, or if you were to come up with your own lyrics, and so part of it's making sure that I understand what language is accessible to the people around. But one of the things that I really believe is, this is such a strange thing. I've never said this out loud to a group of people. I'm now knowing that I don't know the people who are going to hear it. I think you will become a better EMDR therapist if you just make a pattern of reading poetry in your own time.
Oh my gosh.
So step one, even outside of the office, outside of what you do with clients, it's lighting up in the right part of the brain that we need practice experiencing, and in the right order. There are fMRI studies that show the difference between reading prose and poetry, and poetry gets us into a comfortable place with that aspect of self that we talked about earlier, especially if you don't trip over, oh, I must interpret this to mean the right thing that the poet. If you can first just let yourself notice what sounds are pleasing to me, what sounds activate me. Do I like alliteration of the B? Or is it more of an S that I'm drawn to today? Am I in love with rhyme, or is that distracting? There's a reason why we sing lullabies to babies. They don't know what the hell we're saying. But we do it. Some of our lullabies are super creepy.
Yes,
but we say them in ways that, communicate safety, because there's the pleasant alliteration and a patterning of speech and things that make it just fine. So step one, I think, just start reading the poetry, be in that world. But step two, clients speak in poetry, especially when they're in EMDR. They're not reporting back in these full sentences. Like, they're giving you concentrated sensory reports. They're describing very imagery-based issues, and they're doing it in ways that are so poetic naturally that we then get to repeat back that rhythm, even if we're not verbally doing it, like it's coming into us and then finding a home and energetically coming back. It enhances the processing, I think, to just be engaged in the rhythm of what they're saying as much as the content of what they're saying. And it gives you all these body cues about what's happening. Sometimes I will say to them, you wrote a poem, and I'm hearing the same poem repeat itself, and it'll become an interweave if they're blocked. I'm going to tell you the 3 lines you're saying, and tell me, what do you need the 4th line to be? And then it's just they just wrote a poem, and they just unstuck themselves, through the same rhythm that they were already using outside of their awareness.
Well, and I love that you're cueing in with that to the place of wisdom within them. that very same place that's so lit up by the poetic, rhythm of regulation, that is the same place that our, self emerges from. So really, when we're creating that co-constructed poem together, that's coming from both of our place of really innate and co-regulated wisdom. I love that so much.
Oh, I love that you speak nerd.
Yeah.
Man, that is delightful.
The most nerd.
It is really good.
It was really good. That's amazing.
Yeah, I think also that there's sometimes, the journaling that might need to happen outside of session, it can be overwhelming, that can be problematic. And so I like teaching about a haiku. What if instead of getting stuck on the intrusive image, if I transform that into how can I make this fit the syllables, not in like a rigid way, but I just transition my focus of the image into now a different way of being with it, and then close the book, write the haiku, and then fold it up, put it away, and it's just a different way to do, that log of containment. So I think there's lots of little places it belongs in the process.
One of the things that I'm kind of just subjectively curious about is with this expressive way of doing this work, which I find myself agreeing very intuitively with a lot of the things you're saying, even just with the way that I am with my clients. Just kind of going with spontaneity. I talk a lot about that, and this kind of place of playfulness within ourselves, of even in this sort of dark and dreary place of exploring these traumatic experiences, what kind of curiosity can we still hold on to in our exploration? But how do you find yourself just transitioning from points of the therapeutic process along, with such a tool chest of different experiences to have? How do you just subjectively experience that process of therapy with your clients?
Yeah, what a good question. I'm not sure, but I'm going to tell you what comes to mind. Is you made me think of Ed Tronick, and the way that he talks about so much of health is really tolerating uncertainty, and making peace with ambiguity and practicing that. So I think that that's what's alive in me a lot of times. Is I'm not trying to communicate to a client that we're reaching for a technique or an intervention that's going to solve something, that we're trying to reach for the thing that's already alive that they just brought in, and that we're using to increase our capacity for not knowing, and understanding that new meaning comes from letting go of certainty. And so they will usually give you cues if they are being really, really declarative about a need for something to become concrete. Let's go to Santry, because you can choose whatever figure and place it wherever you want it to be, and it's contained and it's externalized. And if they're naturally like showing that they're needing rhythm, like they're showing you through their language patterns, through the way they're moving their body, like, okay, let's reach for some poetry there. If I had a client some time ago that as we were doing the work, they were like literally pushing on the table without their awareness. Like I could see them gripping and pushing. I'm like, I think we need the clay. Their hands, if you imagine what material are their hands working with without knowing, it usually their body is telling you, or their language rhythm is telling you what they're looking for. And then you just get to put it in their hands instead of it being a technique.
Yeah, they need another medium of expression. And that's really where you can have that. I just would love to see a panoramic shot of your setup there, because it sounds like you just have a bunch of mediums for potential expression that you, in your sort of dual awareness as a therapist, can sit and be with them while also thinking about what you have available to you in your space to help them say what it is they're saying.
Oh yeah, I do. There's a lot happening here. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah.
There are some things going around, and a lot of times it doesn't go great. A lot of times, like I I suggest something, or I offer something, or they may even choose something, and it brings a rupture. You know, that's part of our work,
Yeah.
is to welcome the rupture and to initiate the repair.
Yeah.
And no matter where the rupture came from, it's my responsibility to take the lead in the repair. And so I think that all of these materials are beautiful, and they're not foolproof in any way.
Yeah.
Things go wrong a lot.
Yeah.
Going wrong is still potentially beautiful.
Yeah.
Gosh, I feel like some of the most powerful healing comes from those moments
Yes.
of rupture right there in the room. Just
Repair.
like you're talking
Yeah.
about the power of the stop sign, the moment they tell you to stop and you respond to that, the moment we can experience tension or conflict or emotion with each other, and then watch how we're able to repair and resolve that.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Yeah. I just was brought to mind one of the ways that I find myself just kind of naturally wanting to go with the person's sort of what they're coming out this moment with inside of them, is just with like ways of reprocessing or ways of resourcing. Like I was just thinking of a kid that I was working with recently where they wanted to be underneath a blanket, like full on kind of fort, and have the buzzer cord going underneath that to hold. And just going through that construction of the fort with them was itself kind of what's coming to mind with your description of the concreteness of the sand tray. Like each pillow that we laid was in, a very important place. And then as we draped the blanket over and they got in there and got the buzzers, like all of that was so important to the process that we were trying to see to fruition.
They did containment.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what containment meant without anyone having to say, this is what containment means. Yeah.
That's so cool.
It's kids are fun that way too, because there aren't as many roadblocks. That would probably be the best way to say it, to them trusting their creativity, because they just are like, all right, sure, I had an idea. I don't have a choice but to do it.
Yeah, I gotta do it.
I love that. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. So I would love for you to share a little bit about the trainings that you offer, the books that you have out, just any of the resources that our listeners could tap into to get more information on what you're talking about today.
Sure. Yeah. I teach usually in the area of, overlap between expressive work and trauma and attachment, so often EMDR. So if you go to my website, you can see what's coming up. I love to teach on dissociation. It's one of my loves in life, is how protective and misunderstood that part of us is. And sometimes as EMDR therapists, we've learned to be afraid of that, which does not help anyone. And so I want to be a part of a reclamation of dissociation.
Yes.
And so those are some of the things that I do. And I was a co-author with Dr. Homeyer on an advanced sand tray therapy book that really prominently explores trauma and sand tray and attachment and sand tray. And then have contributed some chapters to other books. And the most EMDR specific one was Anne Beckley Forrest and Annie Monaco's book on EMDR in the playroom. And I wrote a chapter on sand tray and family play for that. I do some consultation, but to be honest, I'm winding that down. So I have some CITs that are wonderful, but I'm preparing to have a bit of a transition next year. I'm going to be powering down from a lot of what I do and to focus a year on writing and only teaching the workshops that I think are the most congruent with my spirit. I'm needing a bit of a reset and making sure that I'm doing really some depth work. I want to be doing longer things with fewer people. Honor my introversion for a year and then reemerge. And so that's some of the transition and working on a book of poetry during that time too.
Thank you for sharing that.
Where could people find you said you have some consultants in training, which I think we always want to go for the main consultant and say, this is the one I want to talk to, but consultants in training and those who have learned from us, I think can be just as great, and then offer a whole new set of, experiences and areas of knowledge. So if someone wanted consultation in some of these specific areas, how could they get in touch with someone who's been trained by you?
So I keep a spreadsheet of CITs I'm currently working with and those that have promoted up to ACs, and they all indicate on there what are their areas of focus and specialization and practice, and whether or not they do individual, group, combo. And so sometimes I have it linked directly through my website, and sometimes I take that link down and just ask people to email me. So if you go to my website and you don't see the link active, then just shoot me an email and I will gladly share that with you as needed.
Okay. Will you give your web address for the listeners so they can find that easily?
I will. It's my name smushed together, MarshallLyles.com. So it's MarshallLyles.com. So 3 L's in the middle. Just keep going. You'll get there.
Okay, we'll make sure that that's in the show notes as well. That will be kind of the main spot. I guess they can find everything. Yeah, you've got some really neat sections on there. You have one on poetry. You've got one on all the other podcasts that you've been on, so people can listen more to hear you speak about these things, your books, writings, and things on there. So those of you that are interested in hearing more on this, please check out his website to get more exposure to this great information.
Thanks for the work the two of you are doing as well. Of really trying to communicate to the world, the beautiful work that's possible by diving into a different way of doing this model. So very appreciative of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You as well, Marshall. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time today. And hopefully sometime in the future, we'll get to connect again professionally and maybe have a conversation more on disabilities and things like that. I would love to talk again.
And dissociation. That's also where the neurobiology of dissociation, I'm very interested. So
I would love it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.